The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Ashford Manor, casting long shadows across the marble floors that Elena had walked countless times over the past decade. She stood in the grand foyer, her fingers tracing the intricate patterns carved into the banister of the sweeping staircase, memorizing every detail as if seeing it for the first time and the last time simultaneously. Elena Montgomery had never imagined that her life would lead to this moment. Born into modest circumstances in a small coastal town, she had met David Ashford during her final year at university. He was everything she wasn't: wealthy, established, destined for a life of public service and social obligations that stretched back generations through his family line. Yet somehow, against all odds and expectations, they had found each other in the crowded chaos of a charity fundraiser where she had been volunteering as a server and he had been the guest of honor. Their courtship had been a whirlwind of stolen moments between his parliamentary duties and her work as a social worker in the city's most challenging neighborhoods. David had been drawn to her authenticity, her unwavering commitment to helping others, and the way she could make him forget the weight of his inherited responsibilities with just a laugh or a gentle touch. Elena had fallen in love not just with David the man, but with his genuine desire to make a difference in the world, his quiet strength during difficult political battles, and the vulnerability he showed only to her in their most private moments. The wedding had been a spectacle that neither of them had truly wanted but that his position had demanded. Hundreds of guests, media coverage that dissected every detail of her dress and background, and protocol officers ensuring that every moment adhered to centuries-old traditions. Elena had smiled through it all, knowing that the man waiting for her at the altar was worth every uncomfortable moment under public scrutiny. The early years of their marriage had been challenging, but filled with hope. Elena had thrown herself into charitable work, using her new platform to advocate for causes close to her heart: child welfare, domestic violence prevention, and mental health awareness. She had learned to navigate the complex world of political partnerships, state dinners, and carefully scripted public appearances while maintaining her core identity and values. David had been her anchor during those difficult adjustment years. He would find her after particularly challenging public events, usually hiding in their private sitting room, still wearing her formal attire but with her shoes kicked off and her carefully styled hair beginning to escape its pins. He would sit beside her without saying a word, sometimes pulling her feet into his lap to massage away the ache from hours in designer heels, other times simply offering his presence as she processed the constant pressure of public life. They had found their rhythm eventually, creating a partnership that balanced his political career with her advocacy work. David had risen through the ranks of government, his natural charisma and genuine dedication to public service earning him respect across party lines. Elena had built her own reputation as a fierce advocate for social justice, never shying away from difficult conversations or controversial causes when they aligned with her convictions. But the foundation of their world began to crack when they started trying to have children. What should have been a joyful chapter of their lives became a source of private anguish as months turned to years without the pregnancy they both desperately wanted. The medical appointments, the treatments, the hope followed by crushing disappointment became a cycle that tested every aspect of their relationship. The public, of course, noticed. Speculation about Elena's childlessness became a constant undercurrent in media coverage of their public appearances. Opinion pieces questioned her worthiness as a political spouse, suggesting that her inability to provide an heir somehow reflected poorly on David's fitness for higher office. The pressure was relentless and deeply personal, turning what should have been a private struggle into public property. Elena remembered the exact moment when everything began to unravel. It was during a state dinner honoring visiting dignitaries from a neighboring country. She had been seated next to the visiting minister's wife, a woman roughly her own age who spent the entire evening discussing her 4 children and their various accomplishments. Every question directed at Elena seemed to circle back to family planning and future children, delivered with the kind of innocent curiosity that felt like arrows to her already wounded heart. David had noticed her distress from across the table. Their eyes had met during the woman's particularly enthusiastic description of her youngest son's first steps, and Elena had seen her own pain reflected in his gaze. They had developed a kind of silent communication over the years, able to read each other's emotions and needs with just a look or subtle gesture. That night, his expression had promised that they would escape as soon as protocol allowed. But protocol hadn't allowed an early exit. They had endured 3 more courses, speeches, and a reception that stretched well past midnight. By the time they finally reached their private quarters, Elena was emotionally and physically exhausted. David had tried to comfort her, but something had shifted that evening. The weight of public expectation had settled between them like a wall that even their love couldn't completely breach. The fertility treatments had intensified after that, becoming more invasive and emotionally demanding. Elena had thrown herself into the process with the same determination she brought to her advocacy work, researching every option and pushing herself through procedures that left her feeling disconnected from her own body. David had been supportive, but increasingly helpless as he watched the woman he loved disappear into a cycle of medical interventions and crushing disappointment. Their relationship had begun to change in subtle ways that only they could notice. Conversations that once flowed naturally became careful and measured, both of them afraid to voice the growing fears and resentments that therapy and good intentions couldn't seem to address. Their physical intimacy, once spontaneous and joyful, became clinical and scheduled around treatment protocols and optimal timing for conception. Elena had started spending more time in their country estate, claiming she needed the peace and quiet to focus on writing a book about her advocacy work. In reality, she needed space from the constant reminders of their struggles that seemed to permeate every corner of their London residence. David had respected her need for solitude, visiting on weekends when his schedule allowed, and supporting her project even as he felt her pulling away from him. The country house had become Elena's refuge, a place where she could walk for hours through the gardens David's grandmother had designed decades earlier, or lose herself in the extensive library that housed generations of family history. She had found a kind of peace there that had been missing from her life for months, but it was the peace of withdrawal rather than healing. It was during one of these extended stays that Elena had made the decision that now brought her to this morning, standing in the foyer of their London home, preparing to leave everything behind. The realization had come to her gradually, like watching the sun set over the gardens, beautiful and inevitable, but marking the end of something precious. She had understood that their love, while genuine and deep, had become a casualty of circumstances beyond their control. The public pressure, the medical struggles, and the growing distance between them had created a situation where staying together felt like slowly suffocating everything they had once cherished about each other. They had begun to hurt each other not out of malice, but out of the desperate frustration of people drowning who could no longer reach each other's hands. The decision to leave hadn't been made in anger or during a fight. There had been no dramatic confrontation or moment of betrayal. Instead, it had crystallized during a quiet dinner at the country house when David had visited for what would unknowingly be the last time. They had eaten in comfortable silence, both reading, she her manuscript notes, he briefing papers for an upcoming legislative session. The domesticity of the moment had been both beautiful and heartbreaking because Elena had realized that they had become skilled at being together without truly connecting. After dinner, they had walked through the gardens as they had so many times before. David had pointed out new growth on the rose bushes his mother had planted years earlier, and Elena had shared her plans for expanding the herb garden near the kitchen. They had talked about everything except what was happening between them, maintaining the careful politeness that had replaced their old easy intimacy. That night, as David had fallen asleep beside her, Elena had listened to his breathing and known with absolute certainty that she couldn't continue living this way. Not because she didn't love him, she did, desperately and completely, but because their love had become something that trapped them both in cycles of disappointment and obligation that were slowly destroying the people they had been when they first found each other. The planning for her departure had been meticulous and heartbreaking. Elena had spent weeks organizing her affairs, quietly transferring her personal belongings from their shared spaces, and making arrangements for her future that didn't include the life they had built together. She had written and rewritten a letter explaining her decision, trying to find words that could capture the complexity of loving someone enough to leave them. She had chosen this particular morning because she knew David's schedule would keep him at Parliament until late evening. She couldn't bear the thought of a confrontation or lengthy discussion that might weaken her resolve or make him feel responsible for changing her mind. Some decisions, she had realized, were too important to be swayed by emotion or the desperate desire to avoid causing pain. Now, standing in the foyer with her single suitcase and the letter she would leave on his desk, Elena felt the weight of every memory these walls contained. The celebration dinner they had hosted here after David's first major legislative victory, when he had thanked her in his speech for being his conscience and his inspiration. The quiet Christmas mornings when they had opened gifts by the fireplace in the sitting room, still in their pajamas and surrounded by the kind of intimate happiness that few people ever experience. The late-night conversations in the kitchen when one of them couldn't sleep, sharing fears and dreams over cups of tea while the rest of the city slept around them. All of those moments felt simultaneously precious and painful now, like looking at photographs of a beloved person who had died. The love that had created those memories was real and enduring, but the life that had housed them was ending. Elena understood that she was choosing to become a widow to her own marriage, mourning something that was still alive, but no longer sustainable. The grandfather clock in the corner of the foyer chimed 8 o'clock, its deep tones echoing through the empty house. Elena knew that David would be in his office by now, preparing for a committee hearing that would likely last most of the day. She pictured him reviewing his notes, perhaps drinking the strong coffee that she had learned to make exactly the way he preferred it, completely unaware that by evening his entire life would have changed. The guilt of that knowledge was almost unbearable. She was about to shatter the world of the man she loved more than her own life, and she was doing it without giving him a chance to fight for them or try to change her mind. But Elena had recognized that some situations couldn't be fixed through effort or good intentions. Sometimes love meant being brave enough to admit when something precious was dying and merciful enough to let it die with dignity rather than forcing it to linger in increasing pain. She walked slowly through the first floor of the house, her footsteps echoing in the formal rooms that had hosted countless political gatherings and intimate dinners. In the dining room, she paused beside the table where they had shared so many meals, remembering the early days when David would come home from Parliament full of stories about the day's debates and legislative battles. She had loved listening to him describe the complex personalities and shifting alliances that shaped their country's governance, feeling privileged to be the person he trusted with his honest opinions about colleagues and political strategies. The sitting room still held the book she had been reading the last time they had spent an evening there together, a biography of a Victorian-era social reformer whose work had inspired some of Elena's own advocacy projects. David's reading glasses lay folded on the side table next to his chair, waiting for an evening that would never come. The small details of their shared life seemed to mock her decision even as they reinforced its necessity. Elena climbed the stairs to their bedroom, each step feeling like a betrayal of every promise they had made to each other. The room was exactly as she had left it that morning, the bed carefully made and David's clothes for the day laid out on the chair by the window. She had performed these small acts of care automatically, the muscle memory of a marriage that had once felt like the most natural thing in the world. She sat on the edge of the bed they had shared for nearly a decade, remembering the countless conversations they had conducted in this room. Late-night discussions about his political ambitions and her social work, early morning planning sessions for upcoming events, whispered confessions about fears and insecurities that they had never shared with another living soul. This bed had been their sanctuary, the place where they had been most themselves with each other. The jewelry box on Elena's dresser contained the engagement ring and wedding band that she would leave behind, along with the various pieces David had given her over the years to mark special occasions. Each item told a story of their life together. The pearl earrings from their first anniversary, the sapphire necklace he had surprised her with after a particularly difficult period in his career, the simple gold bracelet that had been his grandmother's, and that he had given her on their wedding day. Elena opened the box and looked at these tokens of love and commitment, understanding that leaving them behind was as important as taking her other belongings with her. She was choosing to step away from the identity that these symbols represented, the role of wife and partner that had shaped every aspect of her adult life. The woman who would walk out of this house in a few minutes would be fundamentally different from the one who had entered it as a bride 10 years earlier. The letter she had written to David lay sealed on his desk in the study, the room where he spent his early mornings and late evenings when Parliament wasn't in session. She had written and discarded dozens of drafts before settling on words that felt both honest and kind. The letter explained her decision without blaming him or asking for his understanding, acknowledging the love they shared while accepting that love alone hadn't been enough to bridge the growing distance between them. Elena had tried to capture in those pages the gratitude she felt for the years they had shared and the person he had helped her become. David had believed in her capacity to make a difference in the world even when she had doubted herself, supporting her advocacy work and encouraging her to speak out on difficult issues that other political spouses might have avoided. He had never asked her to diminish herself to fit more comfortably into his world, instead working to create space within that world for her authentic voice and values. But the letter also acknowledged the ways they had failed each other, not through lack of love, but through the accumulation of disappointments and unmet expectations that had gradually eroded their ability to reach each other. The fertility struggles had been only the most visible symptom of deeper issues: the pressure of public life, the sacrifice of privacy and spontaneity, and the slow realization that they had begun to love each other more like devoted siblings than passionate partners. Elena had written about her need to rediscover who she was outside of their marriage, to rebuild a sense of purpose and identity that didn't depend on being half of a couple that the world watched and judged. She had promised to always cherish what they had shared while accepting that some chapters of life must end for new ones to begin. The clock downstairs chimed again, marking 8:30 and reminding Elena that she needed to leave soon to catch her train. She had booked passage to Scotland, where a childhood friend had offered her a cottage to rent while she figured out what came next. The small coastal village where she would be staying was far from London's political circles, a place where she could walk on empty beaches and remember who she had been before she became Elena Ashford. She picked up her suitcase from beside the front door, its modest weight containing only the most essential items from a life that had once required multiple residences and extensive wardrobes for various public functions. The simplicity felt both liberating and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff with no clear view of what lay below. Elena took one final look around the foyer, her eyes traveling over the family portraits that lined the walls. Generations of Ashford ancestors who had lived lives of duty and service, their faces serious and dignified in formal poses. She had tried to honor their legacy while carving out space for her own values and priorities, but the weight of that history had sometimes felt more constraining than inspiring. The front door opened with the same solid weight it had possessed since her first day as mistress of this house. Elena stepped across the threshold and into the crisp morning air, feeling the October wind against her face like a promise of the different life that waited ahead. She didn't look back as she walked down the front steps and toward the car that would take her to the train station, understanding that some farewells were too precious and painful to be witnessed twice. As the car pulled away from Ashford Manor, Elena allowed herself to cry for everything she was leaving behind and everything she would never have. The tears felt cleansing rather than bitter, like rain washing the air clean after a long drought. She was choosing uncertainty over the familiar pain of a dying marriage, hope over the slow suffocation of staying in a situation that no longer served either of them. The letter on David's desk would be waiting for him when he returned home that evening, ready to explain what she couldn't bring herself to say in person. By then, she would be on a train heading north toward a future she couldn't yet imagine, but was finally ready to embrace. The silent goodbye she was choosing felt like both an ending and a beginning, the close of one chapter and the difficult birth of whatever came next. Elena watched the familiar streets of London pass by the car window, each landmark a reminder of the life she was leaving behind. But, for the first time in months, she felt something that had been missing from her daily existence, a sense of possibility that extended beyond the narrow parameters of duty and expectation that had gradually enclosed her world. The fear of an unknown future felt less terrifying than the certainty of remaining trapped in a beautiful life that had slowly become a prison for both of them. The train station appeared ahead, bustling with morning commuters and travelers pursuing their own destinations and dreams. Elena paid the driver and retrieved her suitcase, joining the stream of people moving toward platforms and possibilities. She was no longer Elena Ashford, political spouse and public figure, but simply Elena Montgomery again, a woman with a story to finish writing and a life to rebuild from the foundation up. The silent goodbye she had chosen would echo through both of their lives for years to come, but it was also an act of love as pure as any vow they had ever exchanged. Sometimes the greatest gift two people could give each other was the courage to admit when their beautiful story had reached its natural end, allowing each other the freedom to write new chapters alone. David Ashford returned to the empty house that evening with the weight of a 12-hour parliamentary session heavy on his shoulders. The committee hearings had run longer than expected, with heated debates over proposed healthcare legislation that would affect millions of citizens. He had spent most of the day mediating between opposing viewpoints, searching for compromise solutions that could bridge ideological divides, and produce meaningful progress on issues that mattered deeply to the people he represented. The October darkness had already settled over London by the time his driver deposited him at the front steps of Ashford Manor. David noticed immediately that the house felt different, though he couldn't initially identify what had changed. The subtle alteration in atmosphere was like hearing a familiar song played in a different key, recognizable, but somehow off-center in a way that created an unconscious sense of unease. He called Elena's name as he hung his coat in the front closet, expecting to hear her voice drifting from the kitchen where she often prepared late dinners for him after long days at Parliament. The silence that answered him was deeper than usual, lacking the comfortable background sounds of her presence that had become the soundtrack of his home life. The soft rustle of pages turning as she read, the gentle clink of dishes as she cleaned up from her own dinner, the muted sound of classical music playing from the radio in her study. David loosened his tie as he walked through the first floor, checking the various rooms where Elena might be spending her evening. The sitting room was empty, though he noticed that her current book was missing from its usual place on the side table next to her preferred reading chair. The kitchen showed no signs of recent use, lacking the pleasant aromas of cooking or the warm residue of shared meals that usually welcomed him home. He climbed the stairs toward their bedroom, assuming Elena had retired early with one of the headaches that had been troubling her more frequently in recent weeks. The stress of their ongoing fertility treatments had taken a physical toll that she tried to minimize, but that he had begun to notice in the careful way she moved through their daily routines, as if each action required more energy than it once had. The bedroom was empty, the bed still perfectly made from the morning. David felt the first stirring of genuine concern, though he told himself that Elena had probably decided to spend another few days at their country estate without mentioning it to him. Her extended stays there had become more frequent over the past few months, and he had learned not to question her need for solitude and space to work on her writing project. But something about the room felt definitively different in a way that made his chest tighten with unexplained anxiety. Elena's perfume bottles were missing from the dresser, along with the small collection of jewelry she wore most regularly. The closet doors stood slightly open, revealing gaps where her favorite clothes usually hung. The personal touches that made this space unmistakably theirs, her reading glasses on the nightstand, the small framed photo of their wedding day, the cashmere throw she always kept draped over her side of the bed, were simply gone. David's hands shook slightly as he opened Elena's jewelry box, finding it nearly empty except for a few pieces he had given her over the years. Her engagement ring and wedding band lay carefully placed in the center of the velvet-lined compartment, the diamonds catching the overhead light like tears frozen in crystal. The sight of those rings, abandoned with such deliberate care, hit him like a physical blow that left him struggling to breathe normally. He sank onto the edge of their bed, staring at the empty spaces where Elena's presence had been woven into the fabric of their shared life. The reality of what he was discovering settled over him gradually, like cold water rising around someone who had stepped unknowingly into a fast-moving tide. Elena hadn't gone to the country estate for a few days of writing and reflection. She had left their marriage as quietly and thoroughly as if she had simply evaporated from their shared existence. The letter waited for him on his desk in the study, propped against the lamp where he would be certain to see it when he sat down to review his notes from the day's legislative sessions. Elena knew his habits well enough to predict exactly how his evening would unfold. The systematic review of committee discussions, the preparation for tomorrow's meetings, the careful attention to correspondence that required his personal response. David held the envelope with both hands, recognizing Elena's distinctive handwriting, but afraid to break the seal that would make whatever was inside irrevocably real. Part of him wanted to pretend he hadn't found it, to spend one more night believing that his wife had simply gone to bed early, and that morning would bring her voice calling from the kitchen as she prepared breakfast and asked about his plans for the day. But he had built his political career on facing difficult truths rather than avoiding them, even when those truths challenged his most fundamental assumptions about how the world should work. He opened the letter with the same careful attention he brought to reviewing crucial legislation, understanding that the words inside would reshape his life as dramatically as any law he had ever helped to pass. Elena's voice came through clearly in her carefully chosen words, as if she were sitting across from him in one of their late-night conversations about the complex challenges facing their marriage. She wrote about love and loss with the same honesty she brought to her advocacy work, acknowledging difficult realities without sugarcoating them or offering false hope for easy solutions. The letter explained her decision to leave without asking for his understanding or approval, recognizing that some choices were too personal and painful to be subject to negotiation or compromise. Elena had written about the gradual erosion of their connection, the way public pressure and private struggles had slowly transformed their vibrant partnership into something that resembled a beautifully choreographed performance more than an authentic relationship. She had been especially thoughtful in describing the fertility issues that had dominated their lives for the past 2 years, writing about the medical procedures and emotional disappointments that had slowly changed both of them in ways neither had anticipated. Elena acknowledged that their inability to have children had become a wound that infected every other aspect of their relationship, turning their home into a place of careful conversation and measured hope rather than the sanctuary of spontaneous love it had once been. David read about the loneliness Elena had experienced even when they were together, the sense of being emotionally isolated within a marriage that looked perfect from the outside, but had lost its capacity to nourish either of them. She described feeling like an actress playing the role of a devoted wife, going through the motions of domestic happiness while slowly losing touch with her authentic self and her genuine feelings. The letter contained no accusations or expressions of anger, which somehow made it more devastating than any confrontation could have been. Elena had written about their shared failures with the kind of gentle honesty that had always characterized her approach to difficult conversations, taking responsibility for her own contributions to their problems while avoiding the blame that might have made her decision feel less final. She had included memories of their happiest times together, the early years when their different backgrounds had felt like exciting complementary strengths rather than obstacles to overcome, the shared victories in his political career and her advocacy work, the quiet moments of intimacy that had convinced them both they could handle any challenge as long as they faced it together. But Elena had also written about the gradual realization that some problems couldn't be solved through effort and good intentions, that sometimes love meant being brave enough to admit when a relationship had run its course, and merciful enough to end it before it became something that diminished both people involved. She had chosen to leave while she still loved him deeply rather than staying until resentment and disappointment destroyed whatever genuine affection remained between them. The final paragraphs of the letter were the most difficult for David to read, filled with Elena's gratitude for the years they had shared and her hopes for his future happiness. She had written about wanting him to find someone who could love him without the complications and limitations that had ultimately made their marriage unsustainable. Elena had promised to remember their time together with tenderness rather than regret, asking him to honor their shared history in the same way. David read the letter 3 times before setting it carefully on his desk, his hands trembling with the effort of holding onto something that felt too fragile and precious to survive contact with the real world. The study around him looked exactly the same as it had that morning when he had reviewed his schedule and prepared for what he had assumed would be another ordinary day in his carefully ordered life. But everything had changed in ways that he was only beginning to understand. The woman who had been his partner, confidant, and closest friend for nearly a decade had removed herself from his life as thoroughly as if she had never existed. The future he had been planning, with its careful balance of political ambitions and domestic happiness, had evaporated like morning mist in sunlight. The silence in the house felt different now that he understood its true nature. This wasn't the comfortable quiet of a home where two people were occupied with separate activities, secure in the knowledge that they would reconnect over dinner or bedtime conversation. This was the silence of genuine solitude, the sound of a life that had been built for two people suddenly, accommodating only one. David walked through the house again, this time noticing all the small ways Elena had systematically removed herself from their shared spaces. Her favorite coffee mug was missing from the kitchen cabinet, along with the herbal teas she drank in the evenings and the organic honey she stirred into her morning cup. The bathroom counter showed gaps where her skincare products and medications had been carefully removed, leaving behind only the items they had shared or that belonged exclusively to him. In the sitting room, he found empty spaces on the bookshelves where Elena's favorite novels and reference books for her advocacy work had been housed. She had taken her personal library with the same careful attention she had applied to every other aspect of her departure, removing only what truly belonged to her, while leaving behind the books they had acquired together and the volumes that had been family heirlooms. The thoroughness of Elena's preparations struck David as both heartbreaking and slightly terrifying. She had clearly been planning this departure for weeks, possibly months, organizing her affairs, and making arrangements for a future that didn't include him while maintaining the daily routines of their marriage with no visible change in her behavior or mood. He tried to remember if there had been signs he should have noticed, conversations or moments that might have warned him about Elena's growing unhappiness and her intention to leave. But their recent interactions had been characterized by the kind of careful politeness that he had mistaken for comfortable domesticity rather than recognizing as evidence of emotional distance. They had still shared meals when his schedule allowed, discussing his work and her various projects with the kind of interested attention that had always marked their conversations. Elena had continued to attend political events and social functions as his partner, playing her public role with the same grace and intelligence that had made her such an effective advocate for the causes she cared about. But David began to realize that their physical intimacy had become increasingly rare and scheduled, lacking the spontaneity that had once made their relationship feel effortlessly passionate. Their conversations had grown more superficial over time, focusing on practical matters and shared obligations rather than the deep emotional connection that had originally drawn them together. The fertility treatments had created a clinical atmosphere around what should have been their most intimate moments, transforming their bedroom into something that felt more like a medical facility than a space for romantic connection. David had tried to be supportive and understanding, but he had watched Elena withdraw into herself as each failed cycle had reinforced her sense of inadequacy and disappointment. He had suggested couples therapy several times, but Elena had always found reasons to postpone or avoid those conversations. Now he understood that she had been protecting him from her decision as much as she had been protecting herself, recognizing that therapy might have encouraged him to fight for their marriage in ways that would have made her departure more difficult and painful for both of them. David poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bottle Elena had given him for his last birthday, remembering the card that had accompanied it. She had written about wanting to celebrate the man he was becoming rather than the boy she had first met, acknowledging his growth as both a politician and a human being while expressing confidence in his ability to handle whatever challenges lay ahead. At the time, he had read the card as encouragement for his political ambitions and appreciation for the ways he had evolved during their marriage. Now he wondered if Elena had already been preparing him for a future that wouldn't include her, offering the kind of support and confidence she hoped would help him survive their separation. The house felt impossibly large and empty as David wandered through rooms that had been designed for entertaining and family life. The formal dining room where they had hosted political colleagues and visiting dignitaries seemed particularly hollow, its long table and elegant chairs arranged for conversations and celebrations that would never happen in quite the same way again. He found himself in the kitchen, where Elena had spent so many hours developing the cooking skills that had never come naturally to her but that she had pursued as part of learning to manage their household. David remembered her frustration during the early years of their marriage when elaborate dinner parties had required menu planning and preparation that felt overwhelming to someone who had grown up eating simple meals in a working-class household. But Elena had approached domestic responsibilities with the same determination she brought to her advocacy work, researching recipes and techniques until she could produce meals that satisfied both her standards for nutrition and the social expectations that came with David's position. She had never pretended to love cooking the way some political wives claimed to, but she had mastered it as one more skill required for the life she had chosen. The refrigerator still contained ingredients for meals Elena had been planning to prepare, evidence of a domestic routine that had been abandoned mid-cycle. David stared at the items she had selected during her last grocery shopping trip, probably only days earlier, understanding that even routine household tasks had been performed by someone who already knew she would be leaving soon. The emotional impact of Elena's departure hit him in waves throughout that first evening alone. Initial shock gave way to a profound sadness that settled in his chest like a weight he couldn't dislodge through any amount of rational thinking or emotional processing. The grief felt similar to mourning someone who had died, except that Elena was still alive somewhere, beginning a new life that didn't include him. David tried calling her mobile phone several times, knowing that she wouldn't answer, but needing to hear her voice on the recorded message one more time. The familiar greeting, cheerful and professional in the way she had learned to manage calls from both personal contacts and people connected to his political career, felt like communication from another lifetime. He left one message, keeping his voice steady through an effort of will that reminded him of delivering difficult speeches in Parliament when personal emotions had to be subordinated to public responsibilities. David told Elena that he had found her letter and that he understood her decision, even though he didn't really understand it at all. He asked her to contact him when she felt ready, not to discuss reconciliation but simply to confirm that she was safe and settling into whatever new life she was building. The master bedroom felt like a museum exhibit that first night, preserved exactly as Elena had left it but drained of the living energy that had made it feel like home. David slept in one of the guest rooms, unable to bear the emptiness of the bed they had shared or the constant reminders of her absence that filled their personal space. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the kind of racing thoughts that had once been reserved for major political crises or family emergencies. David's mind kept circling back to moments from their marriage that he wanted to analyze and reinterpret, searching for clues about Elena's growing unhappiness that he had missed or misunderstood. He remembered the gradual changes in her behavior during the fertility treatments, the way she had become more private about her emotional responses to failed cycles, the careful management of hope and disappointment that had replaced their old, easy communication about future plans. Elena had protected him from the worst of her anguish, he realized now, trying to spare him the full weight of her despair about their inability to have children. But her protection had also created distance that David had interpreted as strength and resilience rather than recognizing as evidence of her increasing isolation within their marriage. Elena had been drowning slowly and quietly, maintaining the appearance of coping while internally preparing for the day when she would need to save herself by leaving everything familiar behind. The political implications of Elena's departure began to occur to David as the first shock wore off, and practical concerns started to intrude on his emotional processing. Their marriage had been a significant asset to his career, providing him with credibility on social issues and demonstrating his ability to build successful partnerships across class and cultural divides. Elena's advocacy work had enhanced his reputation as a politician who understood the needs of ordinary citizens rather than just the wealthy donors and party insiders who dominated much of Westminster society. Her authentic commitment to social justice causes had helped him connect with voters who might otherwise have dismissed him as another privileged politician pursuing power for its own sake. The public nature of their relationship meant that Elena's departure couldn't be kept private indefinitely. Political reporters and gossip columnists would notice her absence from official events and social functions, leading to speculation and investigation that could damage David's standing with both colleagues and constituents. He would need to develop a strategy for addressing questions about his personal life while protecting Elena's privacy and his own political future. The challenge would be maintaining dignity and focus on his professional responsibilities while dealing with the personal devastation that threatened to undermine his ability to function effectively in his public role. David had always prided himself on keeping his private and professional lives separate, but Elena's departure made that separation impossible to maintain. His marriage had been so thoroughly integrated into his public identity that its dissolution would inevitably affect every aspect of his political career. But those practical concerns felt secondary to the emotional reality of losing the person who had been his closest companion and most trusted advisor for nearly a decade. Elena had been more than a wife. She had been his conscience, his sounding board, and the person who kept him grounded in values and priorities that extended beyond political ambition and professional success. Without her presence and perspective, David felt unmoored in ways that scared him more than any political crisis he had previously faced. The future that had seemed so clear and achievable just 24 hours earlier now appeared uncertain and overwhelming, like trying to navigate familiar territory in complete darkness. The house around him held thousands of memories of their shared life, but those memories now felt more like ghosts than treasures, beautiful and painful reminders of something precious that had been lost forever. David understood that he would need to rebuild not just his domestic arrangements, but his entire sense of identity and purpose in a world that no longer included the woman who had been his partner in everything that mattered. The silent goodbye Elena had chosen felt both cruel and merciful, sparing them both the agony of prolonged arguments and failed attempts at reconciliation while denying him any opportunity to fight for their relationship or demonstrate that he could change whatever had driven her away. He was left with questions that might never be answered and regrets that could never be addressed through conversation or gesture. As the night wore on and London settled into the quiet hours before dawn, David began to understand that his real challenge wouldn't be explaining Elena's absence to the political world or managing the practical aspects of living alone. His greatest struggle would be learning to live with the knowledge that love, even profound and genuine love, sometimes wasn't enough to sustain a marriage through the accumulated weight of disappointment and loss. Elena's departure was an act of courage that he both admired and resented, recognizing the strength required to leave everything familiar in pursuit of a more authentic life, while mourning the sacrifice that choice demanded from both of them. The woman who had promised to love him for better or worse had kept that promise by loving him enough to set him free from a relationship that had slowly begun to suffocate them both. The Scottish coastline revealed itself through the train window as Elena Montgomery. She had already begun thinking of herself by her maiden name again, traveled toward the small village where she would attempt to rebuild her life from the foundation up. The October landscape was painted in shades of gold and amber, with ancient stone walls dividing fields that had been cultivated for generations, and distant hills shrouded in the kind of mist that made the entire region feel suspended between the real world and something more ethereal. Millhaven was exactly as Elena remembered it from childhood visits to her aunt's cottage, a collection of stone houses clustered around a natural harbor, where fishing boats bobbed at anchor and seabirds called across water that reflected the changeable Scottish sky. The village had perhaps 300 permanent residents, most of whom had lived there all their lives, and whose families had histories that stretched back centuries through marriages and business partnerships that connected everyone to everyone else in intricate webs of relationship. Elena's friend Sarah MacLeod had inherited the small cottage where Elena would be staying from her grandmother, a woman who had taught primary school in Millhaven for 40 years before retiring to tend an elaborate garden that had become legendary throughout the region. Sarah herself had moved to Edinburgh after university, building a successful career in environmental law, but she maintained the cottage as a retreat and had offered it to Elena without hesitation when she had called in tears to explain her situation. The cottage sat at the edge of the village proper, close enough to walk to the single grocery store and post office, but far enough from the main street to provide the kind of privacy that Elena desperately needed. The building itself was nearly 200 years old, with thick stone walls and small windows that had been designed to withstand the harsh weather that could sweep in from the North Sea without warning. Sarah had prepared the cottage carefully for Elena's arrival, stocking the kitchen with basic supplies and leaving fresh flowers from the grandmother's still thriving garden on the scrub pine table that dominated the small dining area. A note welcomed Elena and provided information about the village's limited amenities, the grocery store that closed at 6 o'clock and stayed closed on Sundays, the single pub where locals gathered in the evenings, and the coastal walking paths that provided spectacular views during good weather and dramatic displays of natural power during storms. Elena's first weeks in Millhaven passed in a haze of adjustment and carefully managed solitude. She established routines that had nothing to do with her former life. Early morning walks along the coastal paths, afternoons spent reading in the cottage's tiny sitting room, evenings devoted to the journal she had started keeping as a way of processing the monumental changes she had chosen to make in her life. The physical environment helped her begin the emotional work of separating her identity from the role she had played as David's wife. The cottage required her to perform basic domestic tasks that had been handled by household staff during her years at Ashford Manor: grocery shopping, cooking simple meals, maintaining the small space that was now her entire world. These activities grounded her in immediate, practical concerns that left little room for the kind of abstract worrying that had consumed so much of her energy during the final months of her marriage. The village residents treated her with polite curiosity, but respected her obvious need for privacy. Elena introduced herself simply as a writer taking time away from London to work on a book, which was true enough to satisfy casual conversation without inviting the kind of detailed questions that might have revealed her real identity. Her appearance had changed enough during the stress of the fertility treatments and the emotional turmoil surrounding her decision to leave David that she was unlikely to be recognized by anyone who might have seen her photograph in newspapers or magazines. Elena cut her hair shorter than she had worn it since university, trading the carefully styled length that had been appropriate for political events for a simpler cut that required minimal maintenance and suited the practical demands of her new life. She shopped for clothes in the village's single clothing store, choosing warm sweaters and sturdy boots that prioritized comfort and functionality over the carefully curated wardrobe that had been necessary for her public role. The transformation felt both liberating and disorienting, like shedding a skin that had become too tight, but discovering that the person underneath was unfamiliar after years of careful presentation for public consumption. Elena had to relearn basic preferences about food, entertainment, and daily routines that had been shaped by David's schedule and the social obligations that had structured their shared life. Her mornings began before dawn with long walks along the coastal paths, where she could watch the sun rise over water that stretched unbroken toward the horizon. The physical exercise helped manage the anxiety and restlessness that had plagued her sleep since leaving London, while the natural beauty provided a kind of spiritual nourishment that had been missing from her life during the months of medical appointments and carefully orchestrated public appearances. Elena discovered that she had forgotten how much she enjoyed solitude, not the lonely isolation she had experienced within her marriage, but the chosen quietude of someone who was comfortable with her own thoughts and didn't need constant external validation or entertainment. The cottage's small library contained an eclectic collection of books that had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, ranging from classic literature to local history to practical guides for organic gardening. She found herself particularly drawn to biographies of women who had made significant life changes during middle age, reading about artists who had discovered their true calling after years in unfulfilling careers, activists who had found their voices after periods of domestic conformity, and writers who had produced their best work only after freeing themselves from relationships and social expectations that had constrained their creativity. These stories provided both inspiration and comfort as Elena struggled with the guilt and uncertainty that accompanied her decision to leave David. Reading about other women who had chosen difficult but necessary changes helped her understand that her situation, while painful, was not unique, and that personal transformation often required the kind of courage that felt impossible until circumstances made it inevitable. The journal Elena kept became a crucial tool for processing the complex emotions surrounding her departure from London. She wrote about the relief of no longer having to monitor every public statement and appearance for political implications, the freedom of choosing how to spend each day based on her own interests and needs rather than external obligations and expectations. But she also wrote honestly about the grief that accompanied her liberation, mourning not just the end of her marriage, but the loss of the future she had envisioned with David. They had planned to travel together after his retirement from politics, to spend time in the countryside estate they both loved, to become the kind of couple who had weathered decades of challenges together and could offer wisdom to younger people facing similar struggles. Elena grieved the children they had never been able to have, but she also mourned the versions of themselves that had been lost during the years of medical interventions and disappointed hopes. The couple who had fallen in love and married with such optimism about their future together had gradually disappeared, replaced by two people who loved each other deeply but could no longer reach across the growing distance that separated their emotional realities. Her writing also explored the ways that public life had shaped both her marriage and her sense of personal identity. Elena had genuinely enjoyed many aspects of her role as a political spouse, particularly the opportunities it had provided for advocating for social causes that mattered to her. But she had gradually lost touch with the person she had been before becoming half of a public partnership, adapting herself so thoroughly to the demands of David's career that she was no longer certain which of her opinions and preferences were authentic and which had been developed to complement his public image. The process of rediscovering her individual identity was both exciting and frightening. Elena experimented with interests she had abandoned years earlier, taking up photography as a way of capturing the dramatic coastal scenery and reading poetry that had nothing to do with the serious political and social justice literature that had dominated her recent years. She contacted old friends from her social work days, women who had remained committed to direct service careers while Elena had moved into the more abstract realm of advocacy and policy influence. These conversations helped her remember the passion she had once felt for hands-on work with individuals and families facing immediate crises, the satisfaction of providing practical help rather than working towards systemic change that might take years to achieve. Elena began volunteering at the village's small community center, helping with after-school programs for local children whose parents worked in fishing or tourism. The work was similar to what she had done before meeting David, but it felt different now, less like preparation for something else, and more like valuable activity in its own right. The children, ranging in age from 5 to 14, were curious about the woman from London who had appeared in their village with no apparent family connections or obvious reason for being there. Elena told them stories about city life that fascinated kids who had never seen a building taller than 3 stories, and she helped them with homework that covered subjects she hadn't thought about in years. Working with the children reminded Elena of why she had originally chosen social work as a career, before the practical demands of supporting herself had led to the nonprofit management positions that had eventually brought her into David's orbit. The direct connection with people who needed help, the immediate impact of attention and encouragement, the sense of making a difference in individual lives rather than pursuing abstract policy goals. All of these aspects of the work felt like coming home to a part of herself that had been dormant for years. The village pub became Elena's primary source of social connection with the adult residents of Millhaven. She began stopping by in the evenings, not for the alcohol. She had never been much of a drinker, but for the conversation and the sense of being part of a community that accepted her without requiring detailed explanations of her background or circumstances. The pub's owner, a woman named Margaret who had moved to Millhaven 30 years earlier after her own divorce, seemed to recognize something familiar in Elena's situation without prying into the specifics. Margaret had created a space where people could share as much or as little as they chose about their personal circumstances, understanding that everyone who ended up in a place like Millhaven had some reason for seeking refuge from the larger world. Elena learned about the village's rhythms and concerns through conversations with local residents, the challenges facing the fishing industry, the impact of climate change on traditional agricultural practices, the economic pressures that forced many young people to leave for larger cities. These issues felt both familiar and foreign to someone who had spent years discussing policy implications in abstract terms, but who was now encountering their human reality in concrete, personal ways. The pace of life in Millhaven forced Elena to slow down in ways that had been impossible during her years in London. There was no rushing to appointments or events, no constant pressure to optimize every moment for maximum productivity or social benefit. Days unfolded naturally according to weather patterns and seasonal changes rather than the artificial urgency that had driven her former schedule. Elena began to understand how much stress she had been carrying without recognizing it, tension that had accumulated over years of living according to external expectations and carefully managed public appearances. Her body began to relax in ways that surprised her. Her sleep improved, headaches that had been frequent during the final months of her marriage disappeared, and she found herself laughing more readily than she had in months. But the healing process wasn't linear or simple. Some days, Elena was overwhelmed by loneliness and doubt about her decision to leave David. She would walk the coastal paths with tears streaming down her face, grieving everything she had lost while trying to maintain faith that her choice would ultimately prove to have been the right one for both of them. She missed David with an intensity that sometimes left her struggling to breathe normally. Not the careful, polite version of him that he had become during their final months together, but the man she had fallen in love with, passionate about his work, eager to make a difference in the world, vulnerable enough to share his fears and dreams with her during their most private conversations. Elena wondered constantly about how he was managing without her, whether he was taking care of himself properly or throwing himself into his work as a way of avoiding the emotional impact of her departure. She had to resist the urge to call him dozens of times, knowing that hearing his voice would either strengthen her resolve or completely undermine it in ways that would be unfair to both of them. The local library became another refuge where Elena could access newspapers and magazines that kept her peripherally informed about David's public activities without requiring direct contact. She read about his speeches and committee work with a mixture of pride and pain, recognizing the dedication and intelligence that had originally attracted her to him, while understanding that those same qualities had been insufficient to bridge the growing distance that had developed between them. Elena saw photographs of David at political events, looking composed and professional, but somehow diminished in ways that probably weren't visible to anyone who didn't know him intimately. She could read the subtle signs of stress in his posture and facial expressions, understanding that he was working to maintain his public responsibilities while processing the personal devastation she had caused by leaving without warning or discussion. The guilt of that knowledge was almost unbearable on some days. Elena had chosen a method of departure that protected her own emotional limits while inflicting maximum shock and confusion on the person she still loved more than anyone else in the world. She had been merciful to herself and perhaps cruel to him, prioritizing her need for a clean break over his need for explanation and closure. But Elena also recognized that any other approach would have been impossible to execute successfully. David's natural inclination would have been to fight for their marriage, to suggest compromises and solutions that might have delayed but not prevented the inevitable end of their relationship. A prolonged conversation about their problems would have become an extended negotiation that might have trapped them both in a situation that was slowly destroying them. Her letter had been intended to provide the explanation that she couldn't deliver in person, but Elena knew that written words, however carefully chosen, couldn't convey the complexity of emotions and circumstances that had led to her decision. David deserved better than a letter, but she hadn't been strong enough to give him the face-to-face conversation that their years together had earned. Winter began to settle over Millhaven as Elena approached her second month in the village, bringing shorter days and weather that could shift from mild and pleasant to harsh and dangerous within the span of an hour. The cottage became an even more intimate refuge as outdoor activities became limited, and Elena spent longer hours reading, writing, and simply sitting by the small fireplace that provided both warmth and a hypnotic focus for her racing thoughts. The isolation that winter imposed felt appropriate to Elena's emotional state, creating external conditions that matched her need for withdrawal from the larger world while she figured out who she was becoming. The cottage contained everything she needed for basic survival and comfort, but it also enforced a simplicity that was helping her distinguish between genuine needs and the complicated wants that had accumulated during years of privilege and social expectations. Elena had begun to write seriously for the first time in years, not the careful advocacy pieces that had been necessary for her public role, but personal essays that explored the experience of leaving everything familiar in middle age. The writing felt raw and honest in ways that scared her, revealing thoughts and feelings that she had hidden even from herself during the final months of her marriage. The pages accumulated slowly, not because Elena lacked things to say, but because the emotional intensity of the material required frequent breaks for processing and recovery. She was writing about love and loss, about the gap between public appearances and private reality, about the cost of living according to other people's expectations rather than personal authenticity. Elena wasn't yet certain whether these essays would ever be shared with anyone else, but the process of writing them was helping her understand her own experience in ways that had been impossible while she was still living within the situation she was now analyzing. The distance provided by physical and emotional separation allowed her to see patterns and connections that had been invisible when she was caught up in the daily struggle of trying to maintain a marriage that was slowly suffocating both participants. The approaching holidays brought a new wave of sadness as Elena contemplated spending Christmas alone for the first time in her adult life. She had always loved the elaborate celebrations that David's family maintained, with their ancient traditions and carefully observed customs that connected each year's festivities to centuries of family history. This year, she would experience Christmas as the village of Millhaven observed it, quietly, with community gatherings at the pub and church services that emphasized reflection rather than celebration. The simpler approach felt both lonely and appropriate, matching her current need for contemplation rather than the cheerful social performance that had characterized her recent holiday experiences. Elena understood that she was still in the early stages of a transformation that would likely take years to complete fully. The woman who had left London was still defined largely by what she was running from rather than what she was moving toward, still shaped more by David's absence than by her own emerging preferences and priorities. But she was beginning to glimpse the person she might become, someone who could pursue meaningful work without the constraints of political considerations, who could form relationships based on genuine compatibility rather than strategic social connections, who could make choices about everything from daily routines to major life decisions based on personal authenticity rather than external expectations. The coastal walks that had become central to Elena's daily routine took on new meaning as winter storms brought dramatic weather that transformed the familiar landscape into something wild and powerful. Standing on cliffs above water that crashed against ancient rocks with enough force to shake the ground beneath her feet, Elena felt connected to natural forces that had been shaping this coastline for millennia. The storms reminded her that some changes were gradual and others were sudden, that both erosion and dramatic upheaval played necessary roles in creating the kind of beauty she was witnessing. Her own life had been reshaped by forces she hadn't fully understood until she was strong enough to step away from them and gain the perspective that distance provided. Elena was learning to live with uncertainty in ways that her former life had never required. The future that stretched ahead of her was completely open, containing possibilities that she couldn't yet imagine, but also lacking the security and structure that had defined her adult identity. The freedom was both exhilarating and terrifying, offering opportunities for growth and authenticity that came at the cost of everything she had previously understood about who she was and what her life would contain. The woman who walked the Scottish coastline each morning was still recognizably the person who had married David Ashford and built a public life around supporting his political ambitions. But she was also becoming someone new, more independent, more attuned to her own needs and desires, more willing to prioritize emotional authenticity over social expectations. Elena understood that her transformation was just beginning, that the real work of building a life that reflected her genuine values and preferences lay ahead of her. But, for the first time in years, she felt capable of undertaking that work with energy and optimism rather than the resigned duty that had characterized too many of her recent decisions. The silent goodbye she had chosen had been the first step in a journey toward becoming the person she had been meant to be before circumstance, and social pressure had shaped her into someone else's idea of an ideal partner. The pain of that goodbye would never completely disappear, but it was beginning to coexist with something that felt remarkably like hope. David Ashford had become a master of maintaining professional composure while his personal world crumbled around him like a building whose foundation had been secretly undermined over months without anyone noticing the growing cracks. 3 months after Elena's departure, he moved through his political responsibilities with the mechanical precision of someone who had learned to function on autopilot, saving his emotional energy for the private moments when grief and bewilderment could surface without compromising his public effectiveness. The parliamentary session that had resumed after the Christmas recess brought new challenges that demanded his full attention, but David found that work had become both his salvation and his torment. The complex negotiations surrounding healthcare reform provided a welcome distraction from his personal losses, while the social aspects of political life, the dinner parties, the informal conversations, the couples-based social events that had been such a natural part of his routine, served as constant reminders of Elena's absence. David's colleagues had initially expressed concern about Elena's disappearance from public events, but the discreet inquiries had been handled through careful deflection rather than honest explanation. His chief of staff, a shrewd woman named Patricia who had worked with him for 7 years, had developed a strategy for managing questions about Elena's absence that acknowledged personal time for writing and reflection, without inviting further speculation or investigation. The approach had been largely successful in professional contexts, where political marriages were understood to be complex arrangements that balanced personal relationships with public demands. David's reputation as a dedicated public servant remained untarnished by the speculation about his domestic situation, and his work on important legislation continued to earn respect from colleagues across party lines. But the personal cost of maintaining this facade was enormous. David felt like an actor playing a role that no longer fit him, performing the part of a successful politician whose personal life was stable and fulfilling while dealing with an internal landscape that resembled a disaster zone. The house that had once been a sanctuary shared with Elena had become a museum of their relationship, filled with memories and physical reminders that made moving forward feel like a betrayal of everything they had built together. Patricia had suggested hiring a housekeeper to help manage the domestic aspects of David's life that Elena had previously handled, but he had resisted the idea. Something about bringing another person into their private spaces felt like admitting that Elena's departure was permanent, acknowledging that the life they had shared was truly over rather than temporarily interrupted. David wasn't ready to make that acknowledgement, even 3 months after reading her letter. He had tried calling Elena's mobile phone periodically during the first few weeks after her departure, but the number had been disconnected within days of her leaving. Her solicitor had contacted David's office to arrange for the transfer of her personal affairs, but all communication was handled through legal representatives who provided no information about Elena's whereabouts or her emotional state. David had hired a private investigator to locate Elena, not because he intended to pursue her or attempt to convince her to return, but because he needed to know that she was safe and settling successfully into whatever new life she was building. The investigator had traced her movements to Scotland, but had been unable to determine her exact location, suggesting that Elena had been careful about covering her tracks and establishing privacy in whatever community had become her new home. The knowledge that she was apparently thriving somewhere beyond his reach provided both comfort and additional heartache. David was genuinely glad that Elena was building a life that made her happy, but he struggled with the reality that her happiness required his complete absence from her world. The woman who had once been his closest companion and most trusted advisor was now living as if he had never existed. The parliamentary schedule that had once seemed manageable with Elena's support now felt overwhelming in ways that David struggled to acknowledge publicly. She had handled countless details of his professional life, scheduling social events, managing correspondence with constituents, researching background information on political issues that mattered to him, and her organizational skills had freed him to focus on the substantive work that was his greatest strength. Without Elena's behind-the-scenes support, David felt constantly behind on obligations and commitments that had previously been seamlessly managed. He hired additional staff to handle some of the responsibilities Elena had assumed, but no employee could replicate the intuitive understanding of his priorities and working style that had developed over years of intimate partnership. More significantly, David had lost the person who had served as his moral compass during difficult political decisions. Elena had helped him navigate the complex ethical terrain of political compromise, offering perspectives that balanced idealistic values with practical realities. Her background in social work had provided insights into how policy decisions would affect ordinary citizens, while her intelligence and integrity had challenged him to maintain his principles even when expedient alternatives were readily available. The loss of Elena's counsel became particularly acute during debates over a welfare reform package that would significantly affect families living in poverty. David found himself struggling to develop positions on specific provisions without the benefit of Elena's knowledge about how the proposed changes would impact real people facing genuine hardships. The abstract policy discussions that dominated parliamentary committee meetings felt disconnected from human reality in ways that Elena had always helped him bridge. David began making private visits to community centers and social service organizations in his constituency, trying to develop first-hand understanding of the issues that Elena had once helped him comprehend through her professional experience and personal passion. These visits provided valuable insights into the practical implications of proposed legislation, but they also reinforced his awareness of how much he had relied on Elena's expertise and perspective. The social worker who ran one of the centers, a woman about Elena's age named Marie, reminded David so strongly of his wife that their first meeting left him shaken and distracted for days afterward. Marie had the same combination of practical competence and idealistic commitment that had originally attracted him to Elena, along with a directness about social problems that cut through political rhetoric to focus on genuine solutions. David found himself looking forward to his visits with Marie's organization more than he looked forward to most of his official responsibilities. The work being done there felt immediately meaningful in ways that the abstract debates and procedural maneuvering of parliamentary life often didn't. But David also recognized that his attraction to this type of direct service work was connected to his longing for Elena and his desire to understand the values and priorities that had shaped her decision to leave him. The question of whether to pursue divorce proceedings had occupied David's thoughts for weeks without resolution. Elena's letter had made her intentions clear, but she hadn't initiated any formal legal proceedings to dissolve their marriage. David understood that she was probably waiting for him to take that step, recognizing that his political position made him the more visible target for media attention and public scrutiny. But David couldn't bring himself to contact his solicitors about beginning divorce proceedings. The legal dissolution of their marriage felt like the final admission that their relationship was truly over, closing off any possibility of reconciliation or renewed connection. As long as they remained legally married, David could maintain the illusion that Elena's departure was temporary, a pause in their relationship rather than its permanent conclusion. Patricia had gently suggested that delaying the divorce might create political complications if David's personal situation became the subject of media investigation or opposition research. A separation that had been presented as temporary writing retreat could become damaging if Elena's absence stretched on for months or years without formal resolution. But David wasn't ready to make decisions about his legal status based on political calculations when his emotional state remained so unsettled. The constituency work that had always been one of David's favorite aspects of his political career became more meaningful as he struggled to find purpose and direction without Elena's partnership. Meeting with individual constituents who were facing personal crises, unemployment, housing problems, family disputes that required government intervention, provided connection to immediate human needs that felt more authentic than the broad policy discussions that dominated his Westminster responsibilities. David began spending more time in his constituency office, extending his regular visiting hours, and making himself available for the kind of direct problem-solving work that had originally motivated his interest in political service. The face-to-face encounters with people who needed practical help provided a sense of usefulness and impact that had been harder to maintain during the abstract debates and procedural negotiations that filled much of his parliamentary schedule. One particular case involved a young mother named Sarah whose ex-husband was avoiding child support payments while she struggled to maintain housing and childcare for two small children. David spent hours helping Sarah navigate the complex bureaucratic systems that were supposed to provide assistance, but that often seemed designed to discourage rather than help people in crisis. The work reminded David of the conversations he used to have with Elena about the gap between well-intentioned policies and their implementation in real communities facing immediate problems. Elena had always been able to explain why certain government programs failed to serve their intended beneficiaries, pointing out bureaucratic obstacles and resource limitations that made theoretical solutions impossible to access in practice. Working with Sarah and similar cases, David began to understand these issues from direct experience rather than second-hand explanation. The knowledge was valuable for his policy work, but it also deepened his appreciation for Elena's expertise and his regret at losing her collaboration on the issues they had both cared about most deeply. David's relationship with his parents had become strained as they struggled to understand Elena's departure and his refusal to provide detailed explanations about what had gone wrong in their marriage. Lord and Lady Ashford had been genuinely fond of Elena, appreciating her intelligence and commitment to social causes even when they didn't always understand her working-class background or her passion for direct advocacy work. The elder Ashfords had assumed that David and Elena were experiencing temporary difficulties that could be resolved through counseling or compromise, and they couldn't understand why David wasn't making more aggressive efforts to locate Elena and convince her to return. Their suggestions ranged from hiring better investigators to making public appeals for her to contact him, approaches that David knew would violate Elena's privacy and probably strengthen her determination to maintain distance from their shared past. Family dinners at his parents' estate had become exercises in careful conversation that avoided any direct reference to Elena while maintaining the pretense of normal family relationships. David's mother would ask vague questions about his personal situation that he deflected with equally vague responses about respect for privacy and the need to focus on his professional responsibilities. But David could see the worry in his parents' eyes as they watched him navigate the social obligations that had once been shared with Elena. They understood that his personal struggles were affecting his political effectiveness, even if they didn't know how to help him address the underlying problems. The approaching spring brought a restlessness that David had never experienced before, a sense that he needed to make significant changes in his life, but uncertainty about what those changes should involve. The anniversary of Elena's departure was approaching, marking a full year since she had walked out of their house and effectively ended their marriage without discussion or negotiation. David found himself wondering whether Elena was experiencing similar restlessness in whatever new life she had built for herself. Had she found the peace and authenticity that she had been seeking when she left? Was she happy with her decision to start over completely, or did she sometimes miss aspects of the life they had shared together? The questions were unanswerable without direct communication, but David found himself composing letters to Elena in his mind during quiet moments. Not letters he intended to send, but mental conversations that helped him process his own feelings and maintain some sense of connection to the person who had been his partner for nearly a decade. The parliamentary recess that began in late spring provided David with his first extended period of unstructured time since Elena's departure. Without the demanding schedule of committee hearings and legislative sessions to provide automatic structure for his days, David felt adrift in ways that were both uncomfortable and potentially liberating. He spent several weeks at the family estate where he and Elena had enjoyed some of their happiest times together, walking through gardens that she had helped design and sitting in rooms where they had shared countless conversations about their hopes for the future. The house felt simultaneously comforting and haunted, filled with memories that brought both pleasure and pain in equal measure. David began to understand that his healing process would require more than simply waiting for time to diminish his grief. He needed to actively rebuild his sense of identity and purpose as a single person rather than as half of the partnership that had defined his adult life. The work would be difficult and probably lengthy, but it was necessary if he was going to function effectively in either his personal or professional roles. He arranged to take a sabbatical from his most demanding political responsibilities, planning to spend several months traveling and thinking about what he wanted the next chapter of his life to contain. The decision felt both frightening and necessary, the first major choice he had made based purely on his own needs rather than external obligations or other people's expectations. The travel plans included destinations that he and Elena had discussed visiting together but had never managed to reach due to the demands of his political career and her advocacy work. David wasn't certain whether visiting those places alone would help him process their relationship or simply intensify his sense of loss, but he felt compelled to test his ability to create new experiences that weren't shadowed by memories of their shared past. The night before his departure, David sat in his study reading Elena's letter for what he realized might be the last time. The words that had initially felt like a devastating personal attack had gradually revealed themselves to be an act of love disguised as abandonment. Elena's attempt to free them both from a situation that was slowly destroying everything they had once cherished about each other. David was beginning to understand that Elena's departure had been necessary not just for her own well-being, but for his as well. Their marriage had become a beautiful prison that had trapped them both in roles and expectations that no longer allowed for authentic growth or happiness. Elena had possessed the courage to break free first, providing him with an opportunity to discover who he was when he wasn't defined primarily by their partnership. The realization didn't eliminate the grief or the sense of loss that had dominated David's emotional landscape for the past year, but it did provide a framework for understanding Elena's decision as something other than rejection or betrayal, reconceptualizing her departure as a gift that would ultimately benefit them both even as it caused tremendous immediate pain. David placed the letter in his desk drawer with other important documents, understanding that he would probably never read it again, but wanting to preserve it as a reminder of the complexity and courage that had characterized Elena's approach to their relationship's end. Her words had been honest and kind, acknowledging the love they shared while refusing to pretend that love alone was sufficient to sustain a marriage that had become unsustainable for both participants. The house felt different as David prepared to leave for his extended travels, less like a mausoleum of failed hopes, and more like a place where important chapters of his life had unfolded before giving way to new possibilities. He was taking nothing with him except a single suitcase, and a sense of curiosity about what he might discover when he allowed himself to move forward rather than remaining trapped in analysis of what had gone wrong. For the first time since reading Elena's letter, David felt something that resembled excitement about the future. The path ahead remained uncertain and probably difficult, but it was his path to walk without the constant awareness of how his choices might affect a partner who was no longer present to be affected by them. Elena had given him the freedom to become whoever he was meant to be next, just as she had claimed that freedom for herself when she had walked out of their shared life and into an unknown future. The silent goodbye she had chosen was revealing itself to be not just an ending, but a beginning, offering both of them the chance to discover versions of themselves that their marriage, however loving, had never allowed space to develop. 2 years after Elena Montgomery had walked out of Ashford Manor with a single suitcase and an undeliverable explanation, both she and David were living lives that would have been unrecognizable to the couple who had once believed their love could overcome any obstacle if they simply worked hard enough and remained committed to each other's happiness. Elena stood on the same Scottish cliffs where she had spent countless mornings processing the end of her marriage, but now she was accompanied by a small group of women who had traveled to Millhaven to attend the writing retreat she had begun hosting 6 months earlier. The program, called Reclaiming Voice, attracted women who were navigating major life transitions, divorce, career changes, empty nest syndrome, or the kind of existential questioning that often emerged during middle age. The cottage that had once been Elena's refuge from the world had been expanded with a small addition that included a workshop space and 2 extra bedrooms for retreat participants. Sarah McLeod had become Elena's business partner in the enterprise, handling the practical and legal aspects while Elena focused on the curriculum and facilitation that drew women from across Europe to spend a week writing about their experiences and exploring new possibilities for their lives. Elena's own transformation had been gradual but profound. shaped by the discipline of daily writing, the community connections she had built in Millhaven, and the deep satisfaction of helping other women navigate transitions that paralleled her own experience. The essay she had begun writing during her first winter in the cottage had evolved into a book that would be published the following spring, a collection of personal reflections on marriage, identity, and the courage required to start over in midlife. The book contract had come through a literary agent who had read some of Elena's pieces in a small literary magazine, published by a women's collective in Edinburgh. Elena had submitted her writing on impulse, not expecting publication but needing to test whether her words might resonate with readers who hadn't lived through her specific circumstances, but who understood the universal experience of questioning fundamental assumptions about identity and purpose. The response to her published essays had been overwhelming, generating hundreds of letters from women who recognized their own struggles in Elena's honest exploration of the gap between public appearances and private reality. Many wrote about their own experiences with marriages that looked perfect from the outside but had become emotionally and spiritually unsustainable for the people living within them. Elena's correspondence with these women had gradually evolved into the retreat program, offering intensive workshops that combined writing exercises with group discussions about the practical and emotional challenges of rebuilding life after major relationship changes. The work felt like a natural extension of the social work career she had abandoned years earlier, providing direct support to individuals while also addressing broader cultural issues around women's identity and independence. The current group included a former corporate executive who had left her high-powered job to care for aging parents, a teacher whose children had recently left for university, leaving her questioning her purpose and direction, and a woman who had recently ended a 25-year marriage after recognizing that she was lesbian and could no longer live authentically within a heterosexual relationship. Elena found deep satisfaction in creating space for these women to explore questions that society often discouraged them from asking. The retreat provided permission to examine assumptions about success, happiness, and responsibility that many participants had never questioned before encountering major life disruptions that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about themselves. The writing exercises Elena had developed drew on her own experience of using personal narrative to process complex emotions and discover authentic priorities that had been buried under years of external expectations. Participants wrote about their childhood dreams, their secret regrets, their fears about aging and irrelevance, and their fantasies about lives they might create if they were brave enough to ignore other people's opinions and expectations. Elena had learned to facilitate these discussions with the kind of gentle directness that honored each woman's unique situation while identifying common themes that connected their diverse experiences. The skills required for the work, empathetic listening, insightful questioning, and the ability to help people see patterns in their own stories, felt like a natural evolution of her social work training combined with the emotional intelligence she had developed through her own transformation process. The retreat participants often asked Elena about her own story, curious about the experiences that had led her to develop this particular approach to supporting women through major life changes. Elena had learned to share selectively, providing enough personal context to establish credibility and connection without overwhelming participants with details that might distract from their own exploration. She would speak generally about leaving a marriage that had become constraining despite being built on genuine love, about the challenge of rebuilding identity after years of being defined primarily through relationship to another person, and about the ongoing process of discovering what authentic happiness looked like when it wasn't filtered through social expectations or other people's needs. Most participants didn't recognize Elena's previous identity as a political spouse, and she had chosen not to reveal those details unless directly asked. The woman who led writing retreats in a small Scottish village bore little resemblance to the carefully polished public figure who had attended state dinners and charity galas as David Ashford's wife. Elena's physical appearance had continued to evolve in ways that reflected her changed circumstances and priorities. Her hair was now completely gray, worn in a simple style that required minimal maintenance, but suited her face and lifestyle. She dressed in comfortable clothes that prioritized functionality over fashion, favoring natural fabrics and muted colors that helped her blend into the rural environment that had become her permanent home. But the most significant changes were internal, reflecting a confidence and self-possession that had been impossible to maintain when her public behavior was constantly monitored and evaluated by people who viewed her primarily as an extension of David's political career. Elena had learned to trust her own judgment about everything from daily routines to major life decisions, developing a sense of personal authority that no longer required external validation or approval. The financial independence provided by her book contract and the growing success of the retreat business had been crucial to Elena's sense of security in her new life. She was no longer dependent on anyone else for her basic needs or her ability to pursue work that felt meaningful and personally fulfilling. The cottage belonged to her now. Sarah had sold it to her at below market value, understanding that Elena needed the security of ownership to feel truly settled in Millhaven. Elena's days had developed a rhythm that balanced solitude with community connection, creative work with practical responsibilities, and attention to her own needs with service to the women who sought her guidance. She woke before dawn most mornings to write for several hours before the demands of daily life began, protecting the quiet time that was essential for both her personal reflection and her professional work. The afternoon walks that had been crucial to her initial healing process had evolved into longer hikes through the Scottish countryside, often accompanied by her border collie, Finn, who had appeared at her door as a starving puppy during her second winter in Millhaven. Finn had become Elena's constant companion, providing the kind of uncomplicated affection and loyalty that reminded her daily of the joy that was possible when relationships were based on genuine compatibility rather than social expectations or practical convenience. The village community had gradually accepted Elena as a permanent resident rather than a temporary visitor, inviting her to participate in local decision-making and including her in the informal social networks that sustain small rural communities. Elena served on the committee that organized the annual festival celebrating Millhaven's fishing heritage, and she had helped establish a small library in the community center that served surrounding villages without their own facilities. These civic responsibilities provided Elena with a sense of belonging and usefulness that was grounded in immediate community needs rather than abstract policy goals. The work was often mundane, organizing fundraising events, coordinating volunteer schedules, mediating minor disputes between neighbors. But it felt directly connected to improving people's daily lives in ways that her previous advocacy work hadn't always achieved. Elena maintained limited contact with her former life through occasional emails from friends who had been part of her London social circle, but she had not attempted to reconnect with anyone from David's political world. The clean break she had chosen had been necessary for her transformation, but it had also required sacrificing relationships and connections that had been important parts of her identity for nearly a decade. She had received Christmas cards from a few political wives who had been genuine friends rather than simply social acquaintances, but Elena found herself reluctant to maintain those relationships when doing so would require her to answer questions about her current life that might reveal David's situation to people who would inevitably share that information throughout their mutual social network. Elena had deliberately avoided learning details about David's life since her departure, understanding that curiosity about his adjustment would only make her own healing process more complicated and potentially undermine her commitment to moving forward independently. She had not read newspapers or political magazines that might contain information about his professional activities, and she had asked Sarah to avoid sharing any information that might come through their mutual connections in Edinburgh. But Elena did allow herself to wonder occasionally about David's well-being, hoping that he had found ways to address the personal and professional challenges that her departure had undoubtedly created. She wished him happiness in whatever form it might take, whether that involved new relationships, deeper commitment to his political career, or completely different directions that she couldn't imagine. The guilt about the way she had chosen to leave had never completely disappeared, but it had evolved into something more manageable. Regret about the pain she had caused balanced against appreciation for the courage she had found to change a situation that had been slowly destroying both of them. Elena understood that some decisions were too important to be made collaboratively, requiring individual choice and commitment that couldn't be diluted through negotiation or compromise. Meanwhile, David Ashford had used his extended sabbatical to travel through Southeast Asia and Central America, spending months in small communities where his presence was unremarkable and his personal history was irrelevant to the people he encountered. The experience had provided the kind of perspective on his life and priorities that would have been impossible to achieve while remaining within familiar environments that constantly reinforced his established identity and expectations. David had returned to London after 8 months abroad with a clearer sense of what aspects of his political career genuinely motivated him and which elements had been pursued more from habit and external pressure than from authentic passion. The welfare reform legislation that he had been working on before his departure had become his primary focus, but his approach now emphasized direct community engagement rather than abstract policy development. He had established a foundation that funded innovative programs addressing poverty and family instability, using his political connections and family resources to support grassroots organizations that were developing practical solutions to problems that traditional government services had been unable to address effectively. The work allowed David to maintain his commitment to public service while operating with more flexibility and creativity than the formal political process typically allowed. David had also made the decision to sell Ashford Manor, recognizing that the house had become too associated with his life with Elena to serve as a comfortable long-term residence. He had purchased a smaller property in his constituency, choosing to live more closely connected to the community he represented rather than maintaining the kind of distance that family tradition and social expectations had previously required. The new house reflected David's evolved priorities, comfortable but not ostentatious, designed for informal entertaining and practical daily living rather than formal social events. David had learned to cook for himself and manage his own household maintenance, developing practical skills that had been unnecessary when Elena had handled most domestic responsibilities and household staff had managed the details of running a large estate. David's political colleagues had noticed the changes in his approach and priorities, and his enhanced credibility on social issues had made him a more effective advocate for the vulnerable populations that had always been central to his policy interests. His first-hand experience with personal upheaval had given him greater empathy for constituents facing family crises and major life transitions. The divorce proceedings had been completed quietly through solicitors, with Elena represented by legal counsel who ensured that her privacy was protected throughout the process. The settlement had been generous but not extravagant, providing Elena with sufficient financial security while allowing David to maintain the resources necessary for his continued political and philanthropic work. Neither David nor Elena had attended the formal legal proceedings that dissolved their marriage, choosing to handle the entire process through representatives who could manage the practical details without requiring face-to-face contact that would have been emotionally difficult for both parties. The legal end of their relationship had been as quiet and careful as Elena's physical departure, allowing them to close that chapter of their lives without drama or public scrutiny. David had begun dating someone new, Dr. Sarah Collins, the physician who ran the community health center that his foundation supported. Sarah was 10 years younger than Elena, recently divorced herself, with 2 teenage children and a professional commitment to serving low-income families that aligned with David's evolved political priorities. The relationship had developed slowly and naturally through their professional collaboration, growing from mutual respect and shared values into something that might eventually become the kind of partnership David had thought he might never experience again. Sarah understood the demands of his political career, but had no interest in becoming a traditional political spouse, preferring to maintain her own professional identity while supporting his work in ways that felt authentic to both of them. David appreciated Sarah's independence and her lack of interest in the formal social obligations that had been such a significant part of his life with Elena. Sarah attended political events when her schedule allowed and when she genuinely wanted to be there, but she felt no obligation to prioritize David's career over her own work or her responsibilities to her children. The relationship provided David with companionship and affection without the kind of total integration of lives and identities that had characterized his marriage to Elena. Both he and Sarah had learned from their previous marriages that sustainable partnerships required maintaining individual autonomy and interests alongside shared goals and activities. David had not attempted to contact Elena since her departure, understanding that she had chosen complete separation for reasons that he needed to respect even when he didn't fully understand them. But he had quietly supported the publication of her book through connections in the literary world, ensuring that her work received the kind of attention and promotion that might help her reach readers who would benefit from her insights and experiences. The book's success had provided David with indirect information about Elena's new life, allowing him to understand that she had not only survived their separation but had thrived in ways that created meaning and satisfaction that had been missing from their years together. The knowledge brought both happiness and sadness, joy that she had found the authentic life she had been seeking, combined with grief that their love had been insufficient to provide space for that authenticity within their marriage. On the second anniversary of Elena's departure, both she and David found themselves thinking about each other and the life they had shared, but without the acute pain that had characterized their first year of separation. Elena spent the day hiking through the Scottish Highlands with Finn, carrying a thermos of tea and her journal to a remote location where she could write about the progress she had made and the gratitude she felt for the courage that had allowed her to rebuild her life according to her own values and priorities. David marked the anniversary by visiting the community center where he had first begun to understand the practical impact of social policies on individual families. He spent the day volunteering in their after-school program, working with children whose circumstances reminded him of the populations Elena had served during her social work career and the advocacy work that had been such an important part of her identity during their marriage. Both Elena and David understood that their love story had not ended when their marriage dissolved, but had instead been transformed into something that honored what they had shared while acknowledging that some relationships serve their purpose by helping people become who they need to be rather than by lasting forever. The silent goodbye that had once felt like a devastating abandonment had revealed itself over time to be an act of profound love, Elena's gift of freedom to both of them, creating space for growth and authenticity that their marriage, however genuine and caring, had ultimately been unable to provide. They had loved each other well enough to recognize when that love required letting go, trusting that the future would vindicate the courage required to choose difficult change over comfortable stagnation. In small villages and political corridors hundreds of miles apart, Elena Montgomery and David Ashford continued to build lives that reflected the people they had been meant to become, carrying forward the best of what they had learned from each other while embracing possibilities that could only have emerged through the painful wisdom of learning when to hold on and when to let go.